there is a riddle that merchants whisper when the moon still lingers over the rooftops. What is worth more than gold and yet can be lent like a coin? Elias the merchant thought he already knew the answer, smiling as he counted the day's profits, unaware that a different currency was about to be traded for his dreams and the bargain was about to be struck. A tall man in a dark coat came with a ledger wrapped in leather and an easy smile that smelled faintly of iron and ink. He offered Elias a sum large enough to double the market stall, to buy finer cloth, to bribe chance into favor. Elias took the money, thinking only of tomorrow's gains, and signed the paper with a flourish, not seeing the fine print that would mark his hours like tally marks on a wall. With new bolts of cloth and a promise of better trade routes, Elias's stall brimmed and customers multiplied, each sale a small thunder that confirmed his choice. Yet for every night he stayed late to wrap goods, for every hour he hired help at double pay, a subtle subtraction happened that had nothing to do with coins. He told himself that time, like markets, could be bought back later. And so he traded away the daylight with a confident hand, moving his family's laughter further into the evenings. Elias's children waved from the window as he left for the late market, their faces lit by candlelight and homework, and one night the youngest asked when their father would be back to read the story about the clock that learned to slow down. Elias kissed his forehead and promised a weekend, believing words could patch the hours he lent away, then hurried into the city lights where the ledger's ink waited with patient hunger, and the promise stretched taut like a bridge. On the first night after signing, Elias woke from a dream to find a faint weight around his wrist, like a cool ribbon that tightened when he thought of leisure. He laughed and tossed the feeling aside, yet the ledger's margin had already claimed its first hour in a tidy hand. The town slept while coins chimed in the merchant's mind, and in that quiet the bargain's shadow lengthened, hinting that every loan carries an aftertaste of obligation. Weeks passed, and interest arrived not as a single demand, but like weather that wears a roof slowly. Small increments that needed attention, repairs that seemed affordable until they were not. The lenders, polite and precise, visited with schedules and calendars, asking politely for hours now owed, until the sums required nights turned into a new currency of absence, and Elias found himself trading meals and stories as if they were coinable luxuries, and the ledger's margin kept tasting for more. Elias began to eat alone at lamplit tables, and to listen for footsteps that were not his own, while chairs at home gathered dust and the family calendar filled with crossed-out Sundays. Each crossed box was an hour surrendered to the ledger, and each surrendered hour tightened the invisible links binding his days to due dates. Customers praised the quality, but praise could not mend the silences that multiplied in his house, and with every string of sales, Elias felt the distance grow between his accounts and his heart, inch by quiet inch. One afternoon, a clerk from the ledger house explained a subtle clause that converted missed hours into higher rates, and Elias watched as his careful accounting turned into a mechanical machine that fed on tardiness. The math was cold and unmoved by stories of childhood plays or birthdays missed, and Elias felt the ledger convert his memory into numbers with an indifferent scribble. The counting continued, precise and patient, and the weight around his days grew heavier by calculation, not by malice, and the town watched him bend toward an invisible axis. Whispers followed Elias like loose coins rolling underfoot, some admiring, some pitying, because prosperity and strain often wear the same clothes until you see the shoes. He began to take riskier deals, believing leverage could once again be shrewd, and each new arrangement borrowed not only money but more of tomorrow, compounding promises into obligations until the ledger's ledgers matched his name in small, precise letters. The crowd continued to bargain, but Elias felt increasingly like a man who had sold not just goods, but the hours that once belonged to him. One morning, a bill arrived that required more than the week could bear, a sum that demanded long nights and quick bargains, and when Elias counted, he found that the market could not stretch that far without breaking something precious. He borrowed more to pay the first, and like a bone nailed back together, the repair was temporary and painfully stiff, and the ledger's margin smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a thing that knows it will be fed again. That night, the chains learned the rhythm of his footsteps. A storm arrived like a final exam, sudden and uncompromising, tearing through the market and sending bolts of cloth into mud, and when Elias counted the ruin, he realized that claims on his future had been paid out in full, but left nothing for disaster. The money on loan could not remake soaked thread into customers' steady hands, and in the ruin, the ledger's demands grew louder while his options thinned, showing him the brittle underside of borrowed expansion, and the town watched a man who had multiplied his stores but diminished his margin for misfortune. At the darkest hour, a woman known in whispered tales as the Keeper of Hours visited Elias with an old wooden box and eyes that had counted more seasons than most ledgers had lines. She did not offer money, but instead opened the box to reveal a set of small, brass tokens, each stamped with an hour. She told him that while loans could be redrawn, hours once given could not be printed anew, and her quiet brought him to a place where numbers met meaning, and the weight around his days finally had a name. The ledger, once a tool of convenience, began to feel like a living thing as deadlines multiplied and its owners arrived with a laboratory's patience for payments. They proposed in exchange more capital if he would pledge years, not just money, transforming his future labor into collateral. And in their polite voices, the merchant heard a sentence that sounded like a verdict. Elias realized he had unknowingly been negotiating with time itself, and the proposal brought his choices into focus: to submit and lose the shape of his days, or to fight for a different balance that would be costly in new ways. Elias sat with his children the next afternoon and listened to the small, ordinary noises of home. The pot on the fire, the sewing of a hem, and those sounds struck him more painfully than any tally did because they were the hours he had pawned. He understood then that freedom has prices beyond any ledger's calculation, and that buying time with debt often leaves you poorer in the only currency that truly ends. He decided to bargain differently, to seek not only to repay money, but to reclaim the rhythm of his life, even if it meant simpler comforts for a season, and the decision set him on a path where sacrifice and repair would intersect. Elias returned to the ledger house and asked not for more coin, but for time, requesting a restructuring that would accept smaller payments if he might keep his evenings and Saturdays. The lenders considered him with the curiosity one shows a customer asking to change the weights on a scale. They did not soften easily, but the Keeper of Hours had given him leverage beyond money, a clear account of what his hours were worth to those who loved him, and an honest plan to restore value, and the negotiation became less about legal fine print than about which life he would choose to live. Elias began to change how he measured success. He set aside an hour each morning to sit with his children, a visible account he kept in the same brass tokens the keeper had given him, and he brought those hours to the ledger house as proof of a different kind of currency. The lenders were skeptical at first, but the tokens were a clear ledger of intent, and the new rules, smaller interest, extended terms, fixed days for family, began to stitch a different pattern into his week, slowly shifting the axis of his life from relentless expansion to sustainable living. He started to barter skills with neighbors, mending a roof in exchange for a week of help at the stall, teaching a young apprentice the craft in return for evenings off, and these trades felt less like surrender and more like a reconnection to the town that had always sustained him. The rhythm of exchange returned to its older human form, where value was measured in usefulness and kindness as much as in coin, and Elias discovered that resilience was often crafted in the margins of community, not in the center of credit. Months passed and progress was not dramatic but real. Small repayments made on time, evenings reclaimed for stories and walks, and a gradual reduction in the ledger's appetite as trust was rebuilt rather than coerced. Elias learned to say no to tempting quick gains that required future hours, and the discipline of smaller, steady choices began to mend what had frayed, teaching him that a life rebuilt in slow stitches often lasts longer than one sewn in haste. The chain that once cinched his days loosened because he rewired the system around what he would not trade again: his time. Elias kept 2 books now: the financial ledger of debts and gains, and a second plain journal where he recorded hours spent and hours returned, and this simple division taught him a new kind of accounting that honored both survival and soul. He discovered joy in small economies, an evening of music with neighbors, a repaired roof that cost friendship rather than coin, and the ledger house, once an adversary, came to respect the proof of his steady returns, altering terms in recognition that some things are worth protecting for their own sake. Freedom, he learned, was not the absence of obligations, but the wise choice of which ones to carry. One morning months later, Elias walked the market at sunrise and felt the air differently, not lighter because his stalls were fuller, but because his evenings belonged to him and his children's laughter returned to the house like birds finding a tree. He had paid much money, pride, risky choices, and had been given something rarer in return: the knowledge that time is a trust, not a resource to be endlessly extracted, and the ledger lay closed for now, its pages marked by a man who had learned when to borrow and when to refuse. The parable closes here with a simple fact: wealth without the time to enjoy it is a poor bargain, and money is useful only when it serves a life lived on purpose.